Sometimes you get in the director's chair and you end up making a bad movie. That's not a big deal. Everyone has hits and flops, you know? But sometimes you direct a movie that's so bad that you end up killing a franchise forever or putting it on life support. In this video, I want to take a look at the movies that did just that. It's interesting because in all of these cases, it begs the question, is the movie bad or did the franchise overstay its welcome? In most of these cases, the answer is a resounding yes. I like Michael Bay's Transformers movies more than most people. Most of them I saw in theater multiple times, while the first two are some of my most watched films over the years. They're good fun, and something about robots beating the hell out of each other speaks to me on a primal level. Also, Optimus Prime riding Grimlock in Age of Extinction is one of the best scenes ever committed to film, and Optimus giving a speech in any Transformers movie is always fun to hear. But even for me, the movies overstayed their welcome. Age of Extinction, for all its faults, would have been a good place to end, though Dark of the Moon would have been better. One issue was the cast changes. They dropped Megan Fox for Rosie Huntington-Whiteley, then Shia LaBeouf dropped out because he figured that there wasn't any place to take his character. He and Huntington-Whiteley were replaced by Mark Wahlberg and Nicola Peltz, which meant that Optimus riding Grimlock really had to pull double duty. Even Michael Bay was ready to quit after Dark of the Moon. But he was too successful for his own good, and turning down Paramount's dump trucks full of money was hard to resist. In his words, quote, "I made too many of them. Steven Spielberg said, just stop at 3, and I said I'd stop. The studio begged me to do a 4th, and then that made $1 billion too. And then I said I'm gonna stop here, and they begged me again. I should have stopped. They were fun to do," end quote. His next outing, 2017's Transformers: The Last Knight, was the weakest of the 5. It starts with Merlin, King Arthur, and the Knights of the Round Table for some reason. Then, Optimus gets mind-controlled and turns on his friends. Anthony Hopkins' character conveniently knows about the Transformers and has been entirely absent for a decade's worth of movies. Despite a neat scene in the trailer where Optimus beheads a bunch of robots, the rest of the film falls flat and was forgettable. The Last Knight was assembled by committee, and it shows. We know this because it had 3 people writing the screenplay and 4 working on the story, none of whom were involved in the previous productions. For comparison's sake, the next Transformers movie, Bumblebee, released a year later, had just one person, Christina Hodson, doing the story and the screenplay. The result was the most critically successful and even of the Transformers movies. The Last Knight put the entire franchise on life support, making half of Age of Extinction before it. People were tired of bad Transformers movies. Bumblebee got solid reviews and likely made money at the box office, and for a second, it seemed like the franchise might be on the up and up and in more capable hands. Rise of the Beasts, which at least is more enjoyable than The Last Knight, failed to stick the landing though. While it did better critically than The Last Knight, it was also the lowest grossing of the Transformers movies. It remains to be seen whether or not the planned G.I. Joe crossover pans out and revives it. After Transformers 1 got great reviews but flopped at the box office, Hasbro said that they would stop co-financing all film adaptations, so it's all up in the air now. Other people dislike the Star Wars prequels and sequels far more than I do. Part of it is just me not growing up with the original series, but part of it is also just accepting that the original is always hard to live up to. You can try to remake or improve on classics like Fires on the Plain and Ben-Hur and The Magnificent Seven, but you're always going to fall short. There's also the fact that my introduction to Star Wars was not the movies, but rather Knights of the Old Republic on the original Xbox, still one of the greatest games ever made. That said, I think it's safe to say that, for a decent chunk of the audience, the franchise dropped the ball not once, but twice. Though the rebuke of the prequels has softened since the release of the sequels, it would be wrong to paper over just how much hate the movies, especially Phantom Menace, got upon their release. It came from all sides, from George Lucas's love for CGI and digital filmmaking, which was finally crossing over to the mainstream, to the stilted romance between Padme and Anakin, to, it seems, the very existence of Jar Jar Binks. Criticism of Jake Lloyd, even before the movie was released, earned Newsweek a sharp rebuke from Ron Howard, who, reasonably, took issue with the, quote, potshot at 9-year-old Jake Lloyd, end quote, which he called irresponsible. Ahmed Best, who played Jar Jar, probably had it the worst though. At the very least, it got so bad for him that he considered offing himself. Frank Oz, who puppeted and voiced Yoda, said, reasonably, quote, I just will never understand the harshness of people's dislike of him, end quote. George Lucas, for his part, commented on 2 sets of critics while at Cannes in 2024. The first were the critics that took issue with the prequels, the second were the critics that said that his movies weren't diverse enough. To the former, his message was, it's a kids movie, it's always been a kids movie, which could imply that some fans just need to grow up. To the latter, he said, quote, they would say it's all white men. Most of the people are aliens. The idea is that you're supposed to accept people for what they are, whether they're big and furry or whether they're green or whatever. The idea is all people are equal, end quote. Lucas eventually grew tired of his creation and decided to sell it to the House of Mouse for billions of dollars in 2012. People were happy with the purchase at the beginning. Disney had handled their purchases of Pixar and Marvel like champs in the first decade, and as The Force Awakens came out, it seems as though they were onto something. After all, you don't make more than $2 billion at the box office unless a lot of people rewatch the movie in theaters. Then, Rian Johnson did The Last Jedi and the bottom just dropped out, at least for fans. Critics seem to like it well enough. Before people start raging against the critics, I think it's worth pointing out that critic and fan reception of the Star Wars franchise has been remarkably consistent, usually coming within a few points of each other's and almost always within 10 points on Rotten Tomatoes. This only isn't the case for two Star Wars movies, The Last Jedi, which critics liked and fans hated, and The Rise of Skywalker, which critics disliked but fans, at least those that contributed to Rotten Tomatoes, seemed okay with. Of the mainline films, Phantom Menace is the only one that performs the worst with fans and critics. The Last Jedi made hundreds of millions of dollars less than The Force Awakens, and even J.J. Abrams returning to the franchise did not help with The Rise of Skywalker, which made even less than The Last Jedi. Since 2019's The Rise of Skywalker, Star Wars has been on ice at the movies, though it keeps chugging along on the TV side. Every time Disney announces another Star Wars movie, they inevitably delay it. Soon, it'll be a decade since The Force Awakens was released, and hope had returned to the galaxy. How soon the studio will meet the fans halfway remains to be seen. The first Men in Black movie is one of the funnest films that you'll ever see. Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones work extremely well together. They kind of remind me of Murtaugh and Riggs from Lethal Weapon. The first movie was a critical and commercial success, so, of course, Sony and Columbia wanted to do a second and a third. Unlike most movies where the sequel comes out pretty quickly, Men in Black 2 came out 5 years after the first one, while Men in Black 3 came out 10 years after the second one. I imagine that was mostly because Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith were just very busy, so the studio had to make do as well as they could. While the second Men in Black movie was disappointing, I enjoyed the third one, which ended up being the highest grossing of the films when not adjusted for inflation, and it also got decent reviews. By the end of it, both Jones and Smith said that they would consider doing a fourth one. According to Jones, it would be, quote, easy to pick up where we left off. We know what we are doing, we know how to do it, it's just a hell of a lot of fun, end quote. But, for whatever reason, the series just took a turn. First, they considered rebooting it without the original cast. Then, the studio considered doing a crossover with the Jump Street series, which would have been called MIB 23. Then, instead of rebooting it or doing a crossover, Sony decided to make a standalone sequel, Men in Black International, which can only be described as disappointing. The movie, which had a budget of as high as $110 million, was a financial disappointment and a critical flop. Chris Hemsworth and Tessa Thompson, who had great chemistry in Thor Ragnarok, don't have nearly the same chemistry as Jones and Smith or even Brolin and Smith. According to Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus, quote, amiable yet forgettable, Men in Black International grinds its stars' substantial chemistry through the gears of a franchise running low on reasons to continue, end quote. It's almost 6 years since the franchise's last outing, and it remains to be seen whether or not Sony has the appetite to do another one. Though, if it doesn't have Smith and Jones, you might as well just bury it. James Cameron, contrary to some popular opinion, is not an overrated filmmaker. It's not wrong to say that he's probably the most impressive filmmaker of our times. The man has multiple classics under his belt and kickstarted one of the most important, enduring, and poignant franchises of the 20th century, Terminator. 1984's Terminator and Terminator 2 Judgment Day are widely considered to be some of the most important sci-fi movies ever made, and the second one is a bona fide action classic. They helped turn Cameron and Schwarzenegger into juggernauts that went on to conquer Hollywood and, in Arnold's case, politics. So, of course, even when Cameron himself left Terminator behind, producers and distributors weren't as eager. There were several movies that followed, though Cameron wasn't involved with them. Oddly enough, the most recent one, 2019's Terminator Dark Fate, which was directed by Tim Miller and did have James Cameron's involvement, was the one that put the franchise on ice. To be fair, while people complained about the 3 movies before it, 2003's Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, starring Arnold and directed by Jonathan Mostow, 2009's Terminator Salvation, starring Christian Bale and directed by McGee, and 2015's Terminator Genesis, again starring Arnold and directed by Alan Taylor, each of the movies made money, while Rise of the Machines even got decent reviews. There was reason to think that this one would do even better than the others. again citing the Cameron involvement, and since Arnold was returning, they could play up the reunion angle. Alas, Dark Fate failed to stick the landing. It was a box office bomb and got average reviews. Joe Morgenstern, writing for the Wall Street Journal, said it was, quote, cobbled together by dunces in a last-ditch effort to wring revenue from a moribund concept, end quote. But that's just what one reviewer thinks. What makes Dark Fate a surefire catastrophe is that even the filmmakers did not like it. Tim Miller said that people, quote, hate it because it's the 6th movie and Hollywood should be making original movies and not repeating franchises, end quote. He was even more harsh years later, saying that he thought he could make a good Terminator movie, but that he was wrong. Cameron said that he erred in pushing his vision on Tim Miller. He wanted to reunite with Arnold for old time's sake, and even said that he would not participate if he couldn't get his old friend. Miller, meanwhile, wanted a more up-to-date movie without Arnold. Cameron came around to Miller's take after the fact, saying, quote, it wasn't your Terminator movie, it wasn't even your dad's Terminator movie, it was your granddad's Terminator movie, end quote. Arnold, meanwhile, said that he was done with the Terminator franchise. According to him, both Dark Fate and the previous Genesis, quote, were just not well written, end quote. In April of 2024, meanwhile, Linda Hamilton said that she was done with Sarah Connor. Plans for a sequel were abandoned after the box office performance, though Cameron is apparently working on a reboot. In 2024, Netflix developed a Terminator anime that got decent reviews, so the franchise at least has a way forward. Harry Potter is one of the most beloved film and book franchises out there. An entire generation of readers and filmgoers were raised on it, and the movies, of course, made bank at the box office and consistently got decent reviews. I recall that Deathly Hallows Part 2 was one of the first midnight premieres that I ever did. It was the fun, simpler time meeting up with my friends and lining up in a line that literally went out of the theater. The infectious energy that night was unlike any that I'd experienced at a movie before. So, of course, there was a sense of unease when Warner Brothers decided to tap one of J.K. Rowling's guidebooks, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, for the next incarnation of the franchise. The film was supposed to be a spin-off and a prequel taking place decades before the events of Sorcerer's Stone. Starring Eddie Redmayne and directed by David Yates, the first one landed decently enough critically and commercially, though things soon went off the rails. None of the movies quite had the heart that the Harry Potter movies had. It was literally a Star Wars prequel situation to an extent, where you have to try to balance old and new. While the first one barely managed that, The Crimes of Grindelwald and The Secrets of Dumbledore were unable to pull it off. The second entry made $150 million less than the first one, while The Secrets of Dumbledore barely made half of what the first one did. In 2016, Rowling said that it was supposed to be a 5-part series, but the wheels came off pretty quick. After the poor critical and commercial reception of the third movie, Warner Brothers decided to halt the franchise, which Redmayne seemingly confirmed in October 2024, saying, quote, as far as I know, that's it, end quote. The studio, rather, seems to be refocusing its attention on the Harry Potter TV show, which is expected to premiere in 2026. Whether or not this return to the wizarding world turns out better remains to be seen. I, as always, prefer to remain cautiously optimistic. The X-Men movies have had such a wild run that they deserve a video of their own. There are at least 4 distinct series: the original X-Men trilogy, which consists of 2000's X-Men, 2003's X2, and 2006's X-Men The Last Stand; the Wolverine trilogy, which is 2009's X-Men Origins Wolverine, 2013's The Wolverine, and 2017's Logan, undoubtedly the best of any of the X-Men movies; the Deadpool films, which consists of 2016's Deadpool, 2018's Deadpool 2, and 2024's Deadpool and Wolverine, which was a massive success; and the X-Men prequel quadrilogy, which consists of 2011's X-Men First Class, 2014's X-Men Days of Future Past, 2016's X-Men Apocalypse, and 2019's Dark Phoenix. For a minute, it seemed as though this last set of films, the prequels, were shaping up to be not just the best X-Men movies, but some of the best superhero movies we've had. First Class and Days of Future Past are genuinely great films, and the 2 best of the X-Men movies right after Logan, and the casting of James McAvoy as Professor X and Michael Fassbender as Magneto were perfect. The 2 had such great chemistry, it almost reminded you of Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen. But then came X-Men Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix, 2 of the worst entries in the series. Part of the issue on Apocalypse can be ascribed to disgraced director Bryan Singer, who, at one point, left production for nearly 2 weeks ostensibly to get a thyroid issue checked out. But there would be days where he would text the cast and crew that he wouldn't be there and that they should just continue without him. During those times, Simon Kinberg would fill in. It makes sense, then, that Apocalypse was a disjointed mess. Dark Phoenix, directed by Kinberg, did not fare much better, though I think it's iffy to say that Kinberg is fully responsible. The movie was in post-production for a long time, which led to Fox pushing its initial release date by nearly a year. And perhaps because this was Kinberg's first directorial feature, Fox also seemed to be quite hands-on. They had him do reshoots to incorporate feedback, and Kinberg would end up reworking the third act of the film. The consensus was essentially deep disappointment. William Bibbiani's review for The Wrap seemed almost rueful. In his words, quote, "It would be wonderful to report that Dark Phoenix was an impressive send-off to this long-running franchise. Instead, it's just a disappointingly average superhero flick with a familiar story, disinterested actors, some cool action sequences, and a whole lot of missed opportunities," end quote. Kinberg took the reception like a champ, and whatever interference there might have been, he, like any good director, decided that the buck stopped with him. In his words, quote, "I'm here. I'm saying when a movie doesn't work, put it on me. I'm the writer-director. The movie didn't connect with the audiences. That's on me," end quote. Dark Phoenix would end up being an ignominious end to this incarnation of X-Men, making just $252 million on a mammoth $200 million budget. DC has had an improbably successful history in starting and killing franchises, thanks to steep declines in quality. It's almost impressive in its own way. It happened to Superman, to Batman and Superman, to Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and on and on. Hiring James Gunn is probably the best move that Warner Bros. And DC have made over the last 10 years as it pertains to their movies, though even now I'm only cautiously optimistic. Who's to say that Gunn won't be able to pull it off, especially with the current headwinds? Though the recent DC Extended Universe is no doubt what sticks in people's minds when they think of the franchise-ending movies, we can go back a few decades to find the seeds of the problem. First, they decided to run the Superman movies into the ground. Richard Donner worked magic with 1978 Superman despite facing significant headwinds with the producers. He was unceremoniously fired to the detriment of the series. Each subsequent Superman movie made significantly less before culminating in 1984 Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, which put the Man of Steel on ice for nearly 2 decades. Brandon Routh did what he could for the character in 2006's Superman Returns, and while it did well critically and made $391 million at the box office, its $200 million budget ensured that it was a disappointment. Superman then went back into hibernation until Man of Steel 7 years later. Then there was Batman and Robin. Again, DC and Warner Brothers ended up being the problem. After Joel Schumacher directed Batman Forever, DC wanted him to get started on the sequel immediately, and they wanted him to make it more toyetic or toy-friendly. Val Kilmer, who Schumacher did not get along with, decided to leave Batman. The studio and Schumacher had to scramble in order to find George Clooney. The final result ended up being a movie that everyone, from the actors to the writer to the director, ended up apologizing for. Kevin Feige would call it the most important superhero movie ever made because, quote, "It was so bad that it demanded a new way of doing things. It created the opportunity to do X-Men and Spider-Man, adaptations that respected the source material and adaptations that were not campy," end quote. So I guess something good came out of it. But the movie ended up being such a disappointment that it put Batman on ice for 8 years until Christopher Nolan decided to resuscitate him for Batman Begins. When Nolan left after The Dark Knight Rises, he left DC on a high note. Sure, Green Lantern the year before had clobbered the company. It was a critical and commercial boondoggle, but everyone forgot it in Nolan's glow. People thought that maybe things would be different when Zack Snyder was selected to helm the post-Nolan DC universe. Nope. I like Zack Snyder more than most, but I think he dropped the ball with Man of Steel. I appreciate that he had his own point of view, but Superman has always been about hope and justice, where Snyder's was much more darker in tone. Batman vs. Superman and Justice League, while making hundreds of millions of dollars, were still commercial and critical disappointments. In fact, of all of the DC Extended Universe films, only one ever made more than $1 billion, 2018's Aquaman. But the Extended Universe has essentially been one long, slow, painful death. Wonder Woman 2, flop. Shazam! Fury of the Gods, flop. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, flop. Black Adam, The Flash, and Blue Beetle, flop, flop, flop. It's been a masterclass of what to avoid doing, and it is, frankly, nothing short of disappointing. DC has fantastic characters and fantastic stories. There should be no excuse for the movies performing as terribly as they've done. Perhaps part of it is just that they had to spend time playing catch-up to Marvel throughout the 2010s. Marvel was able to lay the groundwork and build methodically, while DC tried to jump straight into putting the Justice League together. In their rush, they tripped, fell, and never stopped falling. Even Joker 2 was a catastrophe, and that isn't even part of the extended universe. There are some bright spots, like Matt Reeves' The Batman, and I certainly hope that James Gunn is able to get the leeway that he needs to build up. The best thing Warner Bros. Can do right now is stay out of the way. Franchises are like plants. If they're not properly tended to, they can wither away and die. That's happened to a lot of franchises where, in the eagerness to make gobs of money, Studios and creatives ended up missing the mark entirely. They'd be best served by asking whether or not a film is actually necessary for that time. The franchise isn't going anywhere, and the wrong movie can end up doing more financial damage than if they had waited just a little while longer. Patience, after all, is a virtue. If you rush, you might simply rush to ruin.